Willkommen in einem anderen Aufregens video, or welcome to another exciting video, in this case part 25d of my game system history and theory series of videos, in this case covering Napoleonic figure gaming rules, specifically core level. This will replace my previous video on Napoleonic rules, which previously covered all the scales in a single video. In this case I've attempted to group all similar scaled rules together. In some cases rules possess more than one scale and they'll be repeated in each part as required. The method I've broken up the videos is based on the size of formation a player could be expected to field and complete a game within a day. Typically, 50 elements per side over 12 game turns is the maximum a single player can handle for a 4 to 6 hour game. There are some exceptions, but this is a good ground rule which I will use. Now obviously this doesn't cover all types of games. Games which involve multiple players per side can command much larger forces, but these games require a large playing area which can be set up for several months possibly, allowing for the lads to drop by each Thursday for a beer and pizza, or possibly pork, sausage and cabbage in my case, to play a single game turn. That way a 12 game turn game can be completed in 12 weeks. What I'm really talking about in terms of my breaking up of the scale is a club game which needs to be completed within a day, with no more than 6 hours of gaming and 1 hour to set up and pack up at each end. Now rules which use an infantry scale of 50 to 90 men per figure typically only allow for each player to command a corps. The rules in this video are all designed to allow a player to command a force mix of between 5,000 and 20,000 men, with the sweet spot being 10,000 men. This scale allows for figure-focused games as well as gamers, with players able to create their favourite regiments, although with much less figures than the previous scales. The size of the force mix allows for more mixing of troop types, which could be considered as more realistic. It is an optimum scale for those interested in both the figures and also having a good historical game. This was one of the first set of Napoleonic rules which use sequential sequences of play rather than a simultaneous sequence of play. The notes indicate this was based on the system used in the WIG micro armour rules. The rules are still available via Lulu, although the version shown here is a special edition printed back in July 1979. To the best of my knowledge, they are the same rules. These rules have been astoundingly successful and are still being used today, mainly with 25mm, but also a reasonable amount of 15mm players as well. The separate army lists are good if simple, and as long as you use the army lists and keep the size of each force to about 50 elements, they give you a good game. The main issue is the game turn scale, which means there is little manoeuvring before any battle. I feel the way artillery is depicted is unnecessarily complex, but this is not really a major issue. The rules cover an astounding period and the army lists reflect this. While I do not use these rules anymore, they are reasonably playable and complete. Of course, you need to struggle through the terse text, and it's best if someone who knows the rules instructs you in how the rules are to be used. This is a common failing with pretty much every set of rules, although it does vary a bit in terms of how much of a failing it is. I clearly remember when I first purchased these rules, I was excited. However, after several weeks of trying as hard as I could simply not get a game from them. These rules were an attempt to move from an element maneuver based set of rules such as WRG to a formation allocation set of rules where players maneuver elements into an optimal attack position and then let loose with the assembled attacking force or formation. Writing rules for such a revolutionary game system was never going to be easy, and these rules prove that case. The rules are 53 pages long, but you also need to cross-reference another dozen pages at the end. The rules themselves are an awkward format and not conducive to cross-referencing during a game. In the end I gave up. It's possible these rules, once you understand them, are the best since sliced bread was invented, but if the effort involved in learning how to play is this difficult, then they were destined to fail. In defence, the basic philosophy of the rules is brilliant, and creating a set of rules which can be learned and are playable using this idea would be a holy grail, which incidentally I'm also attempting to do myself. However, apart from my attempts, there are a number of 6mm rules which fill this gap, such as Bloody Big Battles for Napoleonics and Bluecoat. Looking on the web, I can't find anything about the rules, so I assume they failed well before the advent of the internet. Garde Corps operational rules for Napoleonic Wars is a bit of a mystery to me. There are 3 versions. The first version is shown here and the third available as a free download. The third version seems to have significant changes compared with the first, so I'm uncertain how advanced the first version was, as the third version is filled with innovative and modern ideas. The army lists by themselves are worth it to download these rules. While this scale does not interest me that much these days, I will give these rules a real investigation, as I think they offer something rather unique. Even if I never play the rules, the army lists will be useful in creating army lists for other rules. The rules themselves were influenced by Empire and initially used the Empire basing system. However, by version 3 it had generally adopted the standard 4cm wide element basing system. Corps Commander uses a rather interesting spin on the big base approach, which we've briefly discussed so far and which we'll be discussing in more detail later. The big base here represents a number of elements in base-to-base contact with each other. While this seems similar to the old WRG unit concepts, this collection of elements is actually treated as if it was a single unit for combat rather than individual elements. As a result, basing is not really critical as long as both sides use the same basing sizes. The basing itself uses the 2-rank, 2-figure up front and 2 figures to the rear concept, which is, as I indicated before, common among some of the rules from the US. I'm, again, really uncertain where the idea comes from, but the Age of Eagles, which is based on an American Civil War game system, uses it, so I think that's where it comes from, the American Civil War rules. 2 ranks do look good, I must admit. However, I would prefer 4 wide. The rules uses the concept of orders, but they are simple enough not to be a major issue. These rules are one that I will definitely investigate in more detail, but mainly because I like Panzer Corps, and the designer of Panzer Corps is the designer of these rules. I suspect these rules may be rather good for 6mm. Charcot has 2 scales, a tactical scale and a ground tactical. All scales shown here are ground tactical, and the ground scale is based on the element width scale. The tactical scale, which is what we'll be dealing with in this video, is 1/5 the ground tactical scale using the same scaling system. So this allows you to command a force of about 5,000 to maybe at a stretch 10,000 men, which fits us in the core scale. There are 3 basing systems. I have provided the metric version of basing scheme A. The other systems all allow for smaller bases. I assume to allow play on a smaller playing area. The rules are very short and seem simple enough. It has a reasonable focus on orders, actually very similar to Artie's spearhead rules. I personally don't like orders, but combined with the reserve rule, it works very well. Both players can start with equal armies and select part of their forces to remain in reserve. This is critical, as once given orders, formations find it hard to change orders. Thus the reserves act as the true reserve force. Of course, once a player has committed their reserves, the other player can possibly gain an advantage by committing their reserves last and in another critical part of the battlefield. It's a clever way of resolving a major issue in Napoleonics, that is, how to create a game which is interesting when both forces are equal. Charcot, as the primary scale, is divisional core per side, which is really where it should be categorised, and that's why it's here, was very popular indeed in the USA, and its recent second edition continues to be so. It was a major influence in moving away from the strict figure ratio base to a more abstract element-type battalion basing system. Big Battles Napoleonics is a free set of rules available from the Lancashire Games website. They are very simple, and while they claim to be a Big Battles style of rules, they're probably only suited for, at the most, 2 corps aside. There is only one scenario available, the Battle of Ligny, and a cheat sheet, which also includes a cheat sheet. But as with many freeware rules, support materials in short supply. These are probably good if you're experimenting with a hobby. The rules appear to be designed for 10mm based on the basing of figures. Sam Mustafa is a prolific rules designer indeed. These rules are a classic big base set of rules using 3-inch wide bases and variable unit scales. Each unit keeps tracks of its statistics, so while not specifically a strength point based set of rules, it may as well be. There is nothing wrong with this, but tracking stats for a unit is a major negative feature for any set of rules unless the number of units are kept to a fairly low number. The sequence of play, while not simple, is not too complex for ease of play. The game turn represents a variable time period, assuming 12 game turns for a typical game. Perhaps they represent, on average, 1 hour each. I often find the variable timescale technique is used to get over a number of scale issues when the designer wants to basically create a high-level set of rules that allow people to command large formations, but still wants to get into the nitty-gritty of detail. The basic game system is very innovative, and I personally like it. This is one of the first big base formation maneuver games that I'm aware of, but will turn off some figure gamers because of its board game-like feel. These rules are freeware rules, although I'm uncertain where I actually obtained them from. I would suggest you would need to search for them if you are interested. The rules consist of 139 pages and seem astoundingly complete. The sequence of play is reasonably basic: initiative, strategic movement, morale, fire, tactical move, and then close assault. The fire and close assault are simultaneous and the move phase is alternate, with initiative being the critical factor in determining player order. This really reminds me of Core Commander, but is probably aligned with the older WRG school of rules, although a lot more polished and advanced. My guess is these rules were developed because of a dissatisfaction with the older WRG rules, similar to the way BGMR was developed in terms of dissatisfaction with the old WRG micro armor rules. If you are a WRG player, these rules are well worth a look at. Field of Battle is up to its 3rd edition, so these rules must have some traction. The scale is very similar to WRG, but what is really unusual is the use of cards to regulate movement. Each player gets a deck with cards reflecting the commander's capabilities. Players who are experienced at these rules have stated the game system is very good, but without someone to actually explain the rules to you, you may find it a bit difficult to grasp the rules and learn them. There are a number of rather unusual rules which I suspect is aimed at making it as playable as possible. While some players have complained about some troop types being too weak, but on the other hand, as the focus is playability rather than historical accuracy, I do not feel this is a major issue, or none of these issues are major. Field of Battle is a branch of the basic bitchute system, which pioneered the development of decks of cards being used to define the actions taken and their orders. Its original author was very outspoken about this idea, so the rules had a high profile for a while due to that, but seems to have survived to this day. So there must be something in here which is attractive to most gamers. This is another set of rules where the designer doesn't really want you to understand what the scales are, so I've been forced in making a lot of assumptions for the scale. But using the maximum ratio that is actually provided in the rules of 250 men per element, I suspect the guesses that you see here are probably within the ballpark. These rules are mainly focused on playability, being simple, quick and fast play rules. The site I got the info from suggests that these would be a perfect set of rules for conventions or club play, and I suspect this is correct. The only aspect which worries me is the use of square formations, which I would have thought would have been built into the game system at this scale. I found Napoleonic rules designers love the ability of infantry to adopt square formation, and rather than building it into the combat results table, they want to give players the ability to say that's in square and that's not in square. I can't fault the designers, but it does make me think the actual design objective was closer to the lower scale of 50 men per element, where such an idea would be quite applicable. As most of the rules in this scale sector, this is designed for multi-core battles, probably 2 at the most. I would expect about the 10,000 men range, so this would be probably 2 fairly small core. It's an interesting scale choice. Most of the rules seem to focus on pre-battle manoeuvring, which I would have thought would have required a higher scale, but the strategic phase concept is interesting. Major issue with Napoleonic battles is the lack of pre-planning manoeuvring or pre-battle manoeuvring, which often was the key deciding factor in a battle. These rules seem to try and address that issue. I've not studied the rules in depth, so I can't tell how well it would play, but based on the length of the rules, I suspect it's a medium complexity game system. The lack of supporting material is a concern. Polomos Rustogria is specifically designed to cover the North African wars of the later half of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. mainly the American Revolutionary Wars and War of 1812. Thus, the primary focus is infantry combat, which for the period is reasonable. The primary figure scale is 6mm, using the standard 6cm wide bases. The command system is based on tempo points, which is an adaptation of the command point system, although contains some nuances when determining the values. This seems to be the key of the game and its main focus, very much a command-based focus game. The sequence of play starts with fire combat, then movement, and finally close combat. There is a major focus on simplification, with the combat system being simplified in terms of modifiers as much as possible. The aspect which is often mentioned is the use of a D10 dice and the lack of formations such as line, column, square. While for higher scale games this is not unusual, it is a little bit unusual for a company battalion scale set of rules. I suspect house rules would be required to allow you to play in Napoleonic's conflicts. We now go across another set of freeware set of rules. I'm uncertain of the year it was published and the designer. The date and name is my best guess, and I could be wrong. The formatting is very nice, and at 22 pages is an ideal length, but it's not as complete or detailed as Ilan. For example, its real unique feature is it's a hex-based figure gaming set of rules, which tries to minimise the effect of hexes. Its roots are very board game-like, using command points or initiative chits, which is the term they use in the rules, and having a very basic sequence of play, order, move and combat being their basic sequence of play. The sequence is followed by each command, the order of the commands being based on a chit system. The rules are very interesting and there are a lot of good ideas here, but the hex-based system is something which would turn off a lot of figure gaming players. Now, I'm uncertain if this observation is due to the fact that I've been looking at a particular scale of rules, but apart from skirmish rules, and I can assure you I was not actually looking at those rules, this scale seems to possess the most rules. There is a very wide range of rules for a player to select from, and trying to find the most popular set of rules is a real struggle. Obviously, back in the old days, WRG and Empire dominated this scale in their respective countries, with Charcot rising in popularity soon after. Simpler rules, such as Sam, Mustafa, or the Polomos rules, have actually gained significantly in popularity, but generally I suspect in this particular segment there's a lot of older rules being played by a lot of older gamers. In the old days, in this scale, the rules were typically rather complex, or at least very detailed. The later rules started moving towards greater focus on playability, but this is the scale where most of the truly historically focused players gravitate towards, at least the players interested in forming square and are concerned with musket fire range and other associated tactical details. The later rules have attempted to move towards a greater focus on playability, but I suspect if you want playability, you'd be better off focusing on skirmish rules or rules which allow you to duplicate an entire battle. One point about Napoleonic's rules I wanted to briefly cover was basing. Napoleonic's, more than any other period of figure gaming rules, has the most variability in terms of basing systems. For World War II and moderns, it's pretty standard at 3 centimetres or 1 inch wide for 6mm figures. For ancients, it used to be 3 centimetres wide, now it's 4 centimetres wide. The only variability tends to be depths, but generally whatever depth is required for the figure is acceptable. However, for Napoleonics, it's everywhere, from different base widths on the troop type, based on troop types, to basing 4 figures in a line or in a square. I have some theories why this is the case, such as the origin of the rules being used, but it does make it hard for players to try different rules. The trend for more modern rules is to allow for any basing size as long as all the basing of all the figures is the same. I suspect this is required for new rules as everyone has different basing systems. I personally go with the 4 centimetre wide bases with a depth based on the figure depth. I'm experimenting with 2 ranks of infantry on a deeper base, giving me an element of 8 figures, but that's purely for aesthetics and I've kind of turned away from that lately. Players will need to look at basing when selecting a set of rules. If it's too rigid and your figures are not correctly based, you may need to probably bypass these rules as a result. And thus ends my Part 25d video on Napoleonic rules, specifically core scale rules. Some of the links to some of the rules are listed here now. Denken Sie daran, immer für Ihr Heil Heimat zu kämpfen.